Hello everyone, welcome along. We'll just give it a few minutes for people to arrive before we get started. We're expecting quite a few people, so we'll give it a few minutes. Just as always with these things, there's always a bit of an awkward silence as people are waiting. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've got a little picture quiz to keep you thinking while we're waiting, and then see what you can all do. So we've got 6 farmland birds of different levels of commonness, which we have a go at identifying, and then I've got the audio recordings of their songs and calls as well. So we'll start playing a few of them in a moment to test yourselves and see how you get on with identifying those species while we're waiting. I think we had 90 people register, so we may be waiting for a few minutes. Can I check people are able to hear me? If you're able to just raise your hand or something, if you can hear me, so I know people are there. Good, thank you everyone. And we also just need to check on, everyone's muted when they come in. I think if you want to speak, we'll need you to raise your hand, and then Anna will unmute you when we get on to questions in a bit. I'm just going to stop sharing and reshare my slides a second, sorry. Oh no, it should be working. So hopefully you've got those six species on your list. Hello to anyone who's joining as you come in. We're just waiting for people to arrive. We've got a picture quiz of farmland birds to keep you occupied while you're waiting. And I'm about to start playing some bird songs and calls, which see if you can to match them up. So this is number 1. So that's number 1. Have a look, see which you think that could be. And then bird number 2. I thought we'd get some nice summer sounds into the session before we get started and get into a relaxed frame of mind. So that was number 2. Sorry, those who are joining in, we're just filling time for a few minutes, waiting for people to arrive. Have a go at identifying the 6 birds we've got on the screen, and I'm just playing some songs from those species to see if you know your bird songs as well as your visual ID. So number 3. So that was number 3.
Yeah. I mean, people walking, well, they get off
A chatty little one, this next one. One again, quite a few around at the moment, just to give you a bit of a clue. So that was a fan of the Thistles, if you need a clue. Then we're on to number 5. Two more to go. Not so common, this one. You have to be a bit more geographically based for that one, in particular if you're on the south coast. And then the last one that you might find in the garden as well. So this is the sixth and final one of the bird songs, and then we'll do the answers and crack on. Still waiting for quite a few people, so just one last song here. Right, there we go. Okay, a couple of more minutes and we'll get started. So does anyone want to, it's going to be a bit tricky putting hands up, but if anyone, have we got the chat running? If you want to type in the answers in the chat when we run through them. So song number 1, anyone know what that was and which picture it relates to? I can't see the chat. Is there anything going on in the chat? Oh, there we go. So that was a linnet, F. Then we had number 2, the summary one, which is E, and meadow pipits. And number 3 was A. That one's a corn bunting. Then can't keep the numbers. Number 4 was the goldfinch, busy at the moment on the knapweed seeds and the thistles. Quite small groups of them starting to form up now as they race around the countryside. And then number 5 is D, the searle bunting. Slightly blacker markings than the yellow hammer, which is very similar sounding and looking bird. And then finally, we got the good old greenfinch. Right, okay, that was the awkward silence and wait filled. Still quite a few people short, but given it's 4:05, we'll just crack on, I think, and get going with the presentation. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We are recording the session, so you can come back to it afterwards and we'll circulate the link to the recording. My name's Adam Lockyer and I'm Head of Advisory Services for FWAG Southwest. And my colleague Anna Lantaff is also on the call today, and she'll be fielding the question and answer during the presentation. So if you've got any questions you want to raise, please just use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your answers. Anna will try and answer them as we go, and we'll also come back and review them periodically through the presentation. We've got a couple of aims of trying to achieve from today's. So have a quick review of the key information that's been published on the Sustainable Farming Incentive for 2023. Can people just raise their hands if you're already in SFI 22, and if you want any information about the process for people who are already in an SFI agreement, please just raise your hand just so I know that there are people there who are in that situation. Okay, so we will quickly just touch on that. And if you've got any particular questions, just type them in the Q&A as well, and we can just refer to them directly. One of the main things that we're finding that people are interested in, and what I want to put a bit of focus on, is just exploring the decision-making process between choosing between countryside stewardship and the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and how the two schemes interact with each other, and when you may or may not decide to go for one or other or both schemes. Then we'll touch on a little bit about what we know with regards to the application process, the situation for people who are in expiring countryside stewardship agreements, which end in December 23, and hopefully a bit of time at the end to have a wider question and answer. But I'm quite happy to take questions as we go. Either raise your hand if you want to speak up, and Anna will unmute you, or please do, as I say, type it in the Q&A. So if you haven't seen it already, DEFRA have now published a handbook for SFI 23, which includes all of the actions which have been introduced this year, and a bit of information about eligibility and the application process. And so most of the information you have that we're going to go through is published in that handbook. And we're expecting in the next couple of weeks the how-to guides for actually completing the application to be processed, but also the voluntary guidance and advice on how DEFRA envisage the actions being implemented. So hopefully we'll give a bit more of an overview of the practicalities of how to implement the actions. I'm not really going to focus in great detail on each individual action one by one this afternoon, just because there are now 26 and there's quite a lot to cover, and would rather sort of pick up any specific questions you might have on common actions as we go through. So yeah, we'll stick to a higher level sort of review of things. So we've got handbook published and the voluntary guidance and how to apply coming in the next couple of weeks.
Can you turn off the video on the chat? The bandwidth is struggling with sharing.
All right. Okay. Yeah, we can. The video on the. You mean my video?
Yeah.
My video. Okay. So so yes, we got the manual published, the voluntary guidance to come, and the how to guides. So just the sort of high level stuff. It's always hard to gauge with these presentations exactly sort of what people's awareness of the scheme is, and so trying to pitch it for all. So SFI 22, which has now closed for new applications, and existing agreement holders will have their applications terminated. So the RPA are in the process of issuing a 6-month notice on terminating existing agreements, and inviting farmers to apply for the SFI 23. There will also be early termination payments because 3 actions have been dropped from SFI 22 from the soil standards, the add organic matter, the single species cover crops, and the minimising bare ground. Those have been dropped because they are based on percentages of areas within the standard, and that doesn't work with the way that the the scheme has now been redesigned. So the RPA are making a early termination payment to calculate the value of those actions which are being dropped, and paying that to farmers who are in SFI 22 for the remainder of their agreement period, to help with just making sure that people get what they had signed up for. And also the termination, making sure that it coincides with the quarterly payments that you'll be receiving on your existing agreement, so that the calculations on the payments are as simplified as possible. So that's why they're issuing 6 months notice. And to be honest, for those who are already in SFI 22, that's not really too much of an issue, as you'll see when we come on to talking about the rollout of SFI 23, that you're not going to be missing out significantly by having that 6-month notice to serve. And part of the justification for that terminating existing agreements is because the RPA and DEFRA have been working to make a greater range of actions available to people, and also restructuring it to make it more flexible and more accessible, which we'll talk about in a moment. So those are sort of the key headlines for anyone with a existing SFI 22 agreement. Don't know if there's any specific questions on that anyone wants to raise before we look at 23 proper. Oh, it says the chat's disabled. Yes, because we want to try and use Q&A. Sorry, that's probably why nobody put their answers to the bird quiz at the start. But yeah. Right. Okay. So just to reiterate, DEFRA's sort of outcomes for SFI, it's around supporting food production and farm products. Well, this is sort of the wider environmental land management schemes as a whole. There's a whole range of outcomes which DEFRA are trying to achieve with these schemes. And the formula that Janet Hughes, the Deputy Director for this work within DEFRA, they're trying to drive uptake. So getting the targets to have 75% of farmers and 75% of farmland in agri-environment schemes, multiplying up against ambition, and therefore really wanting to try and up the level of ambition from the initial sustainable farming incentive up through countryside stewardship and into landscape recovery, and then joining it up and trying to support and incentivize farmers to work together across landscapes, which we look to see what the Countryside Stewardship Plus scheme, and when that is announced next year, how that will help provide additional incentives for collaboration across farms. Those three things combined really deliver the outcomes which DEFRA are working for around these themes on the slide. The main thing we're interested in today is SFI 23. So it's changed quite significantly from the previous year's application round, and that's based on the experience of the previous round. Now, it can be quite frustrating and make it quite complex, dealing with the situation we have at the moment, with schemes being rolled out and things changing on the fly, getting the IT systems, etc., up and running. But yeah, part of the motivation for doing that within DEFRA has been to ensure that there's a consistent offer, there's schemes available for people to apply for all the time, and that by rolling things out in a controlled way, there's an opportunity to test and get the systems working effectively as in a live situation, which it's hard work, but it's the tools we've got to work with. And I think from our perspective, it's making sure that we just navigate our way through that as best we can, with it in mind that the alternative is that everything shuts down while we try and get something together and launched, which is quite difficult to do with the level of change which DEFRA are trying to push through during this agricultural transition. So the offer is much broader than in 22. So we now have 10 different groups of options, actions in SFI, with 26 actions across those 10 groups, and with creating greater flexibility. That therefore have dropped the standards approach, which you might be familiar with from before, and I won't mention again after this, to what they call a pick and mix approach of actions, which looks much the same as you would be familiar with entry-level environmental stewardship and countryside stewardship more recently. And I think part of that also helps in sort of lining up DEFRA's future ambitions of having all of these schemes available through a single platform to apply for. So having a similar structure amongst SFI and countryside stewardship makes that a bit easier. So I say there's 10 sets of actions being introduced, and that comprises of 25 sets of actions, and there's 25 actions spread across those 10. So it ranges from soils and moorlands to hedgerows, integrated pest management, nutrient management, and so forth. Again, a familiar set of actions that you would see if you've been in any previous agri-environment scheme. The key ones really to point out, which are different to what was previously being available, is the management payments, which there are now for integrated pest management planning, nutrient management planning, and soil management planning, and also a standard to support hedgerow surveying, to look at the condition and assess the management needs of your hedgerows. And then on top of that, the introduction of a management payment for this scheme. So you can get an additional £1,000 a holding for your SBI, for your SFI scheme, but you will only get that paid once per SBI. So if your farm business has 2 or 3 SFI agreements, you will only get up to £1,000 a year for your management payment, which is calculated at £20 per hectare of actions up to 50 hectares. Now, the important thing with that, the calculating of that management payment, is that it's the area of actions, not the area in your agreement. So if you've got a 10 hectare field and it's got 5 hectares of actions in it, it's the 5 hectares that count towards your 50 hectare target. And the hedgerows will have an area payment associated with them, but we don't know what the conversion rate is yet in terms of meters of hedgerow into hectares of option. So the manual sets out each of these sets of actions in order. The key things in terms of eligibility: open to farmers eligible for the basic payment scheme, so a minimum of 5 hectares. You don't have to claim basic payment scheme. So you just have to be eligible for the basic payment scheme to apply for this, unlike countryside stewardship, where you don't have to have claimed it to be able to get the payment. You need to expect to have management control for 3 years. So you can have an annual rolling tenancy, and you don't need your landlord's consent to make the application, which increases the flexibility for tenant farmers. And there's allowance that if you lose your tenancy during the agreement for unforeseen circumstances, that you'll be able to terminate the agreement without any reclaim. So it provides a lot more opportunity for shorter tenancies and tenant farmers to be able to access. And it's important to note that land cover and land use, which you hopefully will be familiar with from your basic payment scheme applications, are what are used to assess the eligibility for each action. And we'll come back to this several times during the session, that land cover and land use, that mapping data, is really critical to have right at the start of an application process. And so even though the scheme isn't open for applications now, there's homework that can be done in terms of getting your mapping and doing the preparation for a future application ahead of that being available, the application process being available. So payments are made quarterly from the 4th month of the agreement. There's no annual claim, but you do need to submit an annual declaration to make it clear that to acknowledge that you are continuing to comply with your agreement. But you will be able to make an annual amendment to your agreement to add new actions in as more get introduced into the scheme from 2024 onwards, or to add the new land and add additional actions from the list of currently available actions. So your total annual payment in the scheme is made up of the area of land or length of hedgerows that you've entered into SFI actions, the SFI management payment, which we've talked about, of £20 per hectare up to the first 50 hectares of the eligible SFI actions, and then an additional payment for common land if you're applying for SFI agreements on common land. As we said, as the SFI evolves, we expect more standards to be added, more actions to be added. Sorry, still haven't got used to the new language myself. So that includes things like farm woodlands, agroforestry, and so forth. So there's a few more being developed and explored at the moment. Now, we don't really have time to go through all of the individual standards and actions. So what I wanted to do is really just explain how the manual was set up and just help you with your thinking in terms of assessing what you can apply for. So within the manual at the start, there is a table which sets out all of the actions within the different groups and where they are, what the code is. So we have a new 3-letter code system for SFI to differentiate it from the 2-letter codes in countryside stewardship, and the title of the action. In this table, it describes whether it's rotational, static, and whether it's part or whole field, and your annual payment rate. But really helpfully, it also has this table which includes the land types. So it's a new term that the RPA have introduced, which sits alongside land use and land cover. But yeah, the terminology is much the same in terms of, if you've got an arable land cover, it could be under an arable crop land use code or a temporary grassland land use code. And then it has a tick whether that action is eligible for that land use. And so it makes a quick reference guide at the front of the manual. We've only picked up one error in it so far, and we are expecting the manual to be reissued in the next month or so. And that was the use of arable and horticultural buffer strips on temporary grassland, which is eligible as far as we're aware, but the table at the front says it isn't. But the text for the action later on does say you can. So a useful quick reference at the start. It's worth pointing out that the application process is online and will also do an assessment of eligibility based on your existing mapping. So in theory, you will only be able to apply for for actions on land which is eligible when you do your own application, and that will greatly speed up the processing time and the issuing of contracts. We're seeing, even with countryside stewardship this year, that contracts are already being issued and agreements going live ready for January at this point in the year, before the application deadline for countryside stewardship is even passed. So it's encouraging in terms of seeing how, although we're going through this transition and adapting to these new application routes, it is actually helping in terms of getting agreements out to people and getting payments out to people, which are two obviously critical elements of the scheme as well. So within the manual for each of the actions, there's an additional table which gives you a bit more detail for eligible land. So this is what the table looks like within each of the actions. And then alongside that, quite a comprehensive table which gives you an overview of what countryside stewardship and environmental stewardship and other actions within SFI 23 can be located on the same area of land within your agreement. So this is occupying the same physical space within the field. If the actions are in a different location, so that you've got two part fields, then they could probably go within the same field, but this is focusing on the same physical area, the overlapping of those options. And so that's a really useful reference to pick through when you're just exploring what might be eligible for, you might be eligible for ahead of preparing an application into the scheme. Please do put up your hand if you do have any questions. I'm keeping an eye on whether any lights come on the Q&A and whether any hands get raised. If you do want to interrupt me, please do. So the process for making applications, DEFRA or the RPA are running a controlled rollout this year. So they will be testing it with a smaller cohort of farms from the middle of August onwards. And we will be involved in some of that early piloting and have put forward some farms to test that on. There has been no commitment as to how quickly that rollout will take place, because it all depends on how the technology stands up and the experience it's had at the early stage. But the expectation is that if all goes well, that can be pretty quickly. And so hopefully by the end of the year, most farmers will be able to get applications in. We're expecting that applications will be turned around very quickly because of the cross-checking that the application process does, prevents wrong options being put on in incompatible land uses. And so our expectation is that there'll be a very short delay. I wouldn't want to kind of commit the RPA as to how long that will be, but we're seeing countryside stewardship applications being turned around within weeks now, compared to the months it was taking previous. But it's always a balance in terms of the volume that the RPA are receiving and processing. It's a year-round application, so you can apply at any time, which gives you a bit of flexibility to fit it within your farming calendar. And one of the things we are finding is that some farmers might also want to time their application to fit with their rotations, so that if each year you are expecting that you will want to increase the number of actions and add new land in. If you think about your cropping season and when that's going to be most appropriate to make those changes, then strategic applications to try and fit within your cropping so that you're able to align everything is quite good within this scheme. It's a purely online application route. If you're unable to access that, then there will be a telephone support and a non-digital route for application, but we're not expecting that to be in the form of a paper application or a PDF. It would be a supported or over the phone talk through approach, we suspect. Otherwise, it will be purely online. And two really critical things, I think, that are worth highlighting and getting into our own frame of minds as potential applicants is that it's a very linear application process that the RPA are standing up here. There are certain things that need to be completed before you can move on to the next stage. And the particular one of that is getting mapping changes completed before creating an application. Now, appreciate that there are instances of mapping changes taking quite a long time to get through the RPA process, but the key thing there is if you are submitting an RLE1 form to to make a mapping amendment, when you email it in, to make sure that the scheme you're applying for is within the title of the email, so that it can get fast tracked, and also that hopefully towards the end of the year there will be some new routes for preparing submitting RLE ones, which again should speed up the process, which we've been involved in testing with the RPA and could help people. And with those things in mind, the RPA do hope to be able to be turning around mapping changes within 30 days. And that's sort of their target. But it's always subject to variation, because if changes involve adjacent land in a different ownership, then there are extra checks and balances that need to be considered just to make sure and get the mapping accurately. Plus, it also depends on the quality of maps that you submit and the speed of responding to any requests that the RPA might send you regarding your submission. And then the final thing is just continuing in that mapping theme. It's just absolutely critical that you check that both the land use and the land cover are compatible with the actions that you're wanting to achieve. Choose. You know, we quite often see that people have their land uses correct because they update those with their basic payment scheme submission, but often the land covers are not updated at the same time. So we do often see arable land uses with permanent grass and land covers being a classic, and it's quite easy to, when you go into these online applications and it says is all your mapping up to date, to just assume yes and tick the box and proceed. But we can't really emphasize enough the importance of sort of forensically going through your mapping and checking it aligns with what you have on the ground at the moment before you make your application.
Question for you.
Yes, so the selection of the farmers involved in the first stage of the rollout mid-August, the RPA have gone to stakeholders like ourselves and the NFU, CLA and Tenant Farmers Association, etc., to ask for examples, and they have very specific requests, very specific requirements to make sure that they captured the common and some of the less common combinations of whether you're in a scheme, not in a scheme, BPS, non-BPS, and size, etc. So we have spoken to members who have expressed an interest in applications and put forward, but that very initial rollout, they're only looking at 20 or 30 in the whole country. So it's going to be a very small number and will be a very quick process. They are applications that will need to be submitted literally within a week of being invited to do it, so that the RPA can get some early data. And then they will be rolling out from there. The key thing is, if you are looking to make an application, is to make contact with the RPA to express intent to apply. So when they turn on the early rollout in the middle of August, there should be the option, you'll see the SFI application process appear on your rural payments portal, and there will be details there to request an application, and the RPA will select from those people who are submitting requests for each of the cohorts to go through in that early rollout. So once it's stepped up and turned on online, you'll be able to express interest in applying yourself. So I do recommend getting in there. There's a bit of an unknown, well, I'll come to the unknown in a minute about people in existing agreements. Oh, and there it is. It's useful if I know what slide's coming up. So the SFI 23, things we don't know. So if you're in a countryside stewardship at the moment and it expires at the end of December 2023, as the IT system stands, you will not actually be able to generate an SFI application until the 1st of January, once your existing agreement has ended, if you want to put SFI standards on land which is in your existing CS. So we're seeing quite a large number of people with with CS agreements expire this year, wanting to transfer into SFI. And so we are pushing the RPA on this matter to try and make sure that people can get a seamless transition from countryside stewardship into SFI. But we don't know how that will operate at the moment. So that's something we're pushing. There will be changes to the countryside stewardship in 24, which we don't know what they are and when they will happen in the year, but we know that the RPA have committed to an ambition of improving the way that payments are made to farmers and the frequency that they come, and also the frequency with which you can apply into countryside stewardship, which we don't, as I say, we don't know what that will look like and when in the year it will arrive, but we are expecting some changes there. The actual process for applications, we haven't had a live demonstration of the new software yet, but we expect it will look very similar to the countryside stewardship application process. And as I said earlier, we're waiting in the next couple of weeks for the guidance on that to be published, along with the voluntary guidance. Another unknown that we are pushing for an answer is what is required in terms of hedgerow mapping. So for countryside stewardship, you need to have all of your hedgerows mapped to be eligible. The SFI 23 manual can be read one of two ways in terms of hedgerow mapping. It states that you need to have at least 20 meters of hedgerow in a parcel to be able to apply for the hedgerow standards. But what it doesn't say is whether, if you had 100 meters that you wanted to put in, whether all 100 meters needs to be mapped to include it in your application, or just at least 20 meters. So we're waiting for some guidance there. In general, if you're doing other mapping and your farm isn't absolutely enormous and there's not too many changes, it's probably worth just updating the hedgerow mapping when you do your RLE1 form, and there's guidance in the manuals as to how to do that. And then finally, we just don't know how fast the controlled rollout will take place and how quickly agreements will be issued afterwards. The RPA are being very cautious in terms of overcommitting themselves as to how quickly that may occur. It may be a few weeks to a month, if that, up to 2 or 3 months, depending on what they find. I mean, we've seen from countryside stewardship and the application rollout there that the RPA were unable to pick up on some of the errors within the software until they were getting large volumes of applications going through it, where in the course of a few weeks, they went from a few hundred applications in the system to 4,000, and that was what helped to find the issues. And the RPA were genuinely able to develop and launch the fixes for the most significant issues there within 2 weeks of them being highlighted, and we worked quite heavily with the RPA to make sure that those issues were picked up and dealt with quickly. And I think, to be fair to the RPA, those major ones were. There are still some outstanding issues, but they tend to be affecting a much smaller cohort of farmers, and we expect those to roll out in some further fixes in the coming weeks, and we'll aim to send some updates to members to keep you updated as to what changes are being launched or what fixes are being made. So we had a question in the Q&A about land use and land cover if you do not plough land for arable production for up to 10 years. So a permanent pasture on arable land for up to 5 years. Can you explain what, if anything, we have to do? Well, yeah, it's just a question of keeping those land covers up to date. And when you put land back from what is permanent pasture as per the RPA definitions, remembering when to update both land cover and land use. So yes, land will switch between arable and permanent land covers when you have long rotations. Now, I don't think Claire, my colleague, is on the call, but we've had quite a lot of cake analogies used when trying to explore. Well, actually, sorry, before I plow on. So I wasn't going to go into a great deal more detail on SFI because it's easier to read the manual to look at the individual actions and what they require. If anyone's got any questions about what they've read with regards to the requirements of actions, then please do put your hand up or put them in the chat. What I want to switch my focus onto next is how you navigate choices between the two schemes, because that seems to be for us the most common challenge, and what's proving to be the sort of the bit to navigate to a certain extent. And so, yeah, various versions of cake analogies have happened in terms of whether countryside stewardship is the icing on the cake and which you should prepare first, whether you want to be preparing the icing before you've got the cake batter mixed. But I came to the conclusion that an upside down cake was the closest analogy, because you prepare the topping first by laying that down and filling the cake mixture on top. But once you turned it out, you have got your countryside stewardship sitting on top as the cherry on the top. But we shall unpick that thought process in the next few slides. So countryside stewardship and SFI, if you have any bee orchids like the one in that picture, then it's countryside stewardship you'll be applying for. But eventually there will be one application route for both schemes. So we are kind of going through, as Janet Hughes says, peak complexity at the moment with the rollout of all of these schemes. I genuinely, as best you can, think of the actions within SFI and the options within countryside stewardship as being part of a single scheme, which you then just have to make two separate applications into to be able to access those payments. And you have to be led by yourself in terms of your vision for the farm and what you want to achieve, rather than any perverse incentives that payment rates within options might create. So by all means, use the options as a shopping list to give you ideas as to what you might want to be doing. But on balance, because of the way the payment rates are costed out, and depending on how you look at them, you know, you're best driven by what you want to achieve on your farm, rather than taking on significant costs. So one example of that might be putting in a high-paying flower-rich margin option on the north side of a hedgerow or woodland, where the risks in terms of getting successful establishment are quite high, and there's a chance that you might be re-establishing an option frequently, and therefore incurring additional costs compared to something which might pay half as much, but actually is done and dusted in one go, and you only need to come through and top it once a year. So really think about the practicalities of applying these things, and not just the level of funding that you might get from the option as a whole. The other classic one that we see a lot of at the moment is people going into the herbal lay options for the 380 something pound a hectare that it's offering in countryside stewardship, and then set stocking them when you're grazing, and grazing them out for 6-8 weeks with sheep, and then being back to a ryegrass sward and risking needing to re-establish them and all of the costs associated with that, or putting permanent grass into rotational herbal lay options when you might be losing a season of production in the process of doing that, and disturbing your soil structure, which you've spent years trying to establish, and could achieve productivity gains by considering changes to grazing management or other measures. So it just think really carefully about what you want to do, what is available, how much it's paying you, and actually the realities of applying for it. I know some of that might be a bit patronizing, but we see those examples quite regularly within applications. So we had another question that come through about if you put a grass buffer margin on permanent pasture, can we turn the rest of the field into arable production at some point during the agreement? Yes, is the answer to that. It's a perennial pickle, picking between arable and grass and buffer strips, because the management is slightly different and the payment is slightly different, particularly when it comes to the grazing of the buffer strips. But the reality is at the moment that you just got to put in the buffer strip that's appropriate to what the ground is at the point of application, particularly as your eligibility is based on what it is at the moment. We're working on trying to help the RPA to find a way around that, and with the SFI and the annual amendments, it may be possible that can allow buffers to switch between arable or grassland equivalents. But these grass and arable buffers are probably the most common one that switch between them, between different land covers over the course of an agreement, and it's always going to be a bit of a muddle, I'm afraid. So that's how the schemes work. I've tried to, in as simple form as possible, create a little bit of a diagram, and this is work in progress, I'm afraid, which just helps you to visualize what's available in each of the schemes and how they interact, how they sort of can stack up and interact with each other. So first off, there are things that are only available in the sustainable farming incentive. So if you want to get up to £1,000 a year to help support the administration and management of your agreement, you've got to go into SFI, and we'll explore that one a bit more in a minute. If you're a common and you're looking to collaborate with commoners, then there are additional supplements for commons which are only available in SFI, for things like the moorland standard. And if you're looking for support with management planning, whether that's for hedges, soils, nutrients, or integrated pest management, again, only available in SFI. So that's quite straightforward. If you want any of those, then you have to go into SFI. You then get this kind of murky area in the middle where both the sustainable farming incentive and countryside stewardship overlap. And I suspect over the next couple of years, DEFRA will rectify this either by removing some options which have traditionally been in countryside stewardship and make them available only in SFI, or take actions from SFI and put them into options within countryside stewardship if they're not quite the same. But for now, we've got to deal with this overlap. And really, those are for the sort of common universal farmland habitats and soil health measures. So it's buffer strips, low input grassland, cover crops, herbal lays, and winter bird food, and pollen and nectar type stuff. So the most common options you'll see within agreements, and they do totally overlap with each other. And there's some questions I've got on the next few slides, which you can sort of ask yourself to help just test which direction you go between the two. Then we get on to the icing on the cake in terms of countryside stewardship mid-tier. The things which that will only fund is if you've got historic features like traditional buildings, or priority habitats like species-rich grassland, and traditional orchards. And I've left out of here educational access. So if any of those three are a priority for you, then you have to go into countryside stewardship to access them. So again, that's why you just got to have that plan, write down things that you want, and then almost sort of tick them off against which of the scheme you can get it for, and just see on balance whether you want to go through the process, I was going to say hassle then, but the process of 2 applications or not, depending on whether the reward is sufficient. And then there are things which are only available in countryside stewardship higher tier. So that's the creation of priority habitats, and woodland management, woodland improvement grants, in the main. Now, the big change which has happened this year, which sort of opens up the sustainable farming incentive to be almost the starting point for anyone considering schemes, is that the capital grants for boundaries and yard infrastructure are effectively universal across all of the schemes. So you can now get fencing to support boundary restoration and boundary creation and excluding livestock from watercourses across both the sustainable farming incentive and countryside stewardship. So in general, there's that the incentive to kind of focus on countryside stewardship so that you can include the fencing elements to your capital works program has been removed. So capital grants are generally the same across SFI and countryside stewardship mid-tier. So that removes one of the big questions. The only time the reason I say in general is because there's always going to be an exception to the rule. And the one that we're unpicking at the moment is that if you're introducing grazing for the first time and you're needing fencing to support grazing management options, then arguably it's more the countryside stewardship mid-tier, I would argue, is probably better set up to permit that in terms of how the capital items for fencing are phrased. So if you're introducing grazing and you're putting in grazing management options that need some fencing, if it's not associated with boundary work, then I would just think and read the prescriptions carefully and making a decision there. But other than that situation, it's pretty much the same. So there are some testing, I'll phrase them as testing questions, because this is all about you having a vision and a goal for what you're wanting from your agri-environment scheme, rather than being able to decide which of the two schemes to apply for before you get started. So the first one is the management payment sufficient to warrant 2 applications? So at £20 a hectare up to 50 hectares, if it's a smaller agreement you're putting forward, and the management payment is only working out at a few £100s, just ask yourself, do you want that? Or is countryside stewardship offering you something more? The second question is, will your farm benefit from management plans? There is no point in applying for any of the management plan payments just for the sake of getting the grant for those payments. And that includes the moorland one, which will probably affect no one or a very small number of you on the call, but it's worth considering, and the nutrient management, the hedgerow assessment, the integrated pest management. You have to do those with it in mind that you're going to be using it for the benefit of your business. And if you do think that they'll be valuable, then you've got to go for SFI. And then the third question on this slide is, do you prefer the flexibility of the SFI actions on grasslands, hedgerows and herbal lays over the countryside stewardship equivalents? So very quickly, the grassland standards in SFI has a 7-week shut-up period for cutting rather than the 1st of July cutting date. And also some supplementary feeding is permitted so long as you're still able to deliver the aims of the option. So there's a bit more flexibility in the grassland action in SFI over countryside stewardship. Hedgerows within SFI are definitely much better than they are in countryside stewardship, in that they give you far more flexibility and there is the opportunity to access higher payments. Now, I won't go through all of those in great detail, but the key thing with the hedgerows is that you can cut the hedgerows on an annual rotation so long as you're incrementally cutting them. So you're allowing them to bush out and get a bit bigger each year as you cut them, or you can cut them every 2 years, every 3 years, or not at all. So there's a bit more flexibility there. And there's also an additional payment for hedgerow trees, which isn't available in countryside stewardship. So hedgerows are definitely a winner compared to countryside stewardship. And herbal lays within SFI are a bit more flexible with some easier options in terms of less diverse requirements within the mixes. So again, if you're using herbal lays for the first time, SFI might just give you a little bit more flexibility. And we just had a question around cover crops. Definitely cover crops are more available in SFI, because in countryside stewardship, they have to be on land which is at risk of high nitrate leaching, whereas they're a bit more, well, they are pretty well universally available in SFI. So definitely I should add cover crops to that list of sort of easy decisions. The next set of questions are, so what additional options are there available for you in countryside stewardship? So traditional buildings are a classic. If you've just got one small barn and it's only 30 or 40 square meters, and everything else you can get in SFI, such as the management payment, is it really worth chasing stewardship for those small amounts? And it just becomes a personal preference. Just think, when you've got your list of things you want to do, what are exclusive to countryside stewardship, and is that enough to warrant doing an application for it? We've touched on that. This next one comes under the same category, really. Yeah. Are those additional options significant enough to reduce the area of SFI actions to the point where the management payment is negligible? So you're only going to get your management payment if you can get 50 hectares of actions onto your farm. And if you're thinking, well, actually, I prefer the countryside stewardship option, it might drive down the amount of SFI land that you've got into your agreement to such a small acreage that you don't think it's worth the SFI management payment. Again, I know some of these things might sound a bit obvious, but I think that it's quite important, just thought process to work through. And then, are you happy with the countryside stewardship management requirements? So we talked about that additional flexibility. So do you accept that, a couple of fields of GS2 that you want to put in a wider countryside stewardship agreement actually is no skin off your nose to not supplementary feed and to cut after the 1st of July, and therefore you may as well stick with countryside stewardship than chase a whole extra application and a separate agreement for a small amount of flexibility on a limited number of fields.
Can I just clarify what you said on management payment?
Yeah.
That you don't have to put in 50 hectares before you get any management payment. It's 50 hectares to the maximum payment. Yeah,
so the management payment is based on £20 per hectare up to 50 hectares. So if you put in 25 hectares of actions, you'll get £500. And just some lightly quick decision helpers. If you're an upland farmer and you can achieve the cattle grazing and haymaking supplements or lenient grazing supplements, all of those pay more than £20 a hectare more than the same farming incentive. So the low input grassland option for upland farmers is the same in countryside stewardship as it is in SFI. But in SFI, you'll get your £20 a hectare towards your management payment on top of that, and that's it. Whereas if you go into countryside stewardship, you can access cattle grazing, haymaking, or lenient grazing, which will add £40 a hectare to your agreement value instead. So you may well end up with slightly more, it's a slightly better paying scheme in the uplands if you're wanting to access those supplements. And for lowland farmers, I think unless you've got priority habitats that can go into countryside stewardship, increasingly now we are finding that the sustainable farming incentive is likely to be your best option. Again, I've probably said it too many times now, but having that plan that you can assess what actions and options will help you deliver what your vision for the farm is, has to be the driving factor. Finally, I would just subscribe to the to DEFRA's Future Farming blog for further updates. It is a really useful source of information as DEFRA roll out the scheme and gives you the links to each of the relevant sections within the gov.gov website. But after today, we'll share this presentation and the key links to the manual, etc. And when the guidance is published, we will send out more details. But that's so yeah. In conclusion, really, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll sort of move over to more of a question and answer session if anyone's got any. Yeah, start with SFI, look at those standard options, make sure that they're delivering something that benefits your business before signing up to them. Look at that, a little bit of extra flexibility that's there with those kind of common actions which have equivalent options in countryside stewardship, and we have those few key pointers which I think are coming out as the most common decision makers. If you are going for countryside stewardship, I would still recommend pursuing a countryside stewardship application for the August deadline rather than dealing with rather than waiting until you've got SFI in place, because otherwise you risk having a year's wait on your countryside stewardship options. By the time you've submitted your countryside stewardship application and it's been uploaded into the RPA system, it's quite likely that you'll then be ready to apply for SFI. I don't think applying for countryside stewardship is going to delay your ability to access sustainable farming incentive. And even if you do the sustainable farming incentive second in order, it is still likely to, it will still start paying out, we expect, sooner than countryside stewardship, and so will be better for cash flow. Although, as I say, the RPA are looking at how they can improve cash flow, as we've seen with the interim payments for the basic payment scheme, which the RPA have rolled out in the last week or so. So, cash flow is becoming less of a concern in terms of deciding between those two schemes. Application processes are going to be much the same, and we're expecting agreements to be offered pretty quickly. Mapping is just critical that you're thinking about that from the start and getting that updated, and then using the schemes to deliver what you want for your farm. So we've got some questions coming in on the Q&A now. If you do want to put your hand up and ask them, then Anna can unmute you. The deadline for application for SFI 24, there are none. It's a rolling annual application, so you can once it's open, it's more waiting for when it'll open and when you'll be able to apply. But as I say, from the middle of August, when it's turned on, even if you go in and try to apply and it doesn't let you, you can register with the RPA that you want to, and they will start inviting people in as they test out different farm types and different sizes. So Countryside Stewardship Plus, yeah, we often get asked about that. This Countryside Stewardship Plus is will be DEFRA's collaboration payment. We don't know the exact details as to how it will operate yet, but it's likely to be something perhaps more akin to the facilitation funds rather than an add-on to with new options and things within stewardship mid-tier. So applying for anything now will not penalise you from your ability to access anything that's introduced next year. So I would certainly not hold back on applying for any schemes at the moment, because there will be mechanisms to ensure that you're not disadvantaged. And regarding grass and buffer strips, yeah, the same applies in countryside stewardship as to SFI in terms of whether you apply for a grass and buffer or an arable buffer. It tends to be driven by what land use and land cover you've got in place at the time you apply, and which you prefer to manage with. You know, we do see sometimes that an arable farmer might want to go for the grass and buffer strip on their arable fields because because they know they'll have grazing in the rotation and they want to be able to graze it. So you've got to, sometimes you're stuck with what the computer allows you to do with your land use code, and sometimes you've just got to think about which is going to be better for me across my rotation. So that's the Q&A's covered. Any more for any more? Silence, no hands. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Everyone's got the cameras off, so they're either on their emails or doing something else, or hopefully it's been useful. A few people are starting to drop out now, so I'll probably try and wrap up and thank everyone for your attendance. We will linger around before we shut the meeting down in case anyone does have any more thoughts in the last few moments, but otherwise, thank you very much and enjoy your evening, and we'll email around a summary once we've wrapped up today. Oh, there we go. That's quite right, Jane. Thank you for coming along. Right, okay. Do you want to shut the meeting down, Anna?